Hey guys, welcome to another topical video. Today I'm going to give you 15 tips for swatching. First off, swatching is when you make a little square or a not so little square of fabric that is using the same yarn and needles for your project. And the reason we do this is because you want to be able to match the gauge of the pattern that you're following so that the size that you make matches the size that you're following. Otherwise, your project could end up way too small or way too big. I know a lot of people really hate swatching. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but it is so essential that you really can't skip it. I know that's probably not what you wanted to hear, but it's true. You can't pass it up. You have to do it. So here are my 15 tips for swatching. Number 1, make a large swatch. I know it makes it even worse that you have to make a big swatch because it's more time consuming, but you gotta do it. So this is an example of a big swatch. So this swatch is a good 10 inches wide and a little over 7 inches tall. So ideally you want your swatch to be between 6 and 8 inches square. It can be a little bit rectangular like this one as long as it's long enough in both directions. So I know that sucks because that means more time, but it really gives you a better quality swatch. It's as if you cut this out of your final project. It's better quality and it will give you a more accurate swatch because it gives you time to really get into the groove of knitting in the same way that you would for your final project. Number 2 is very similar. You don't want to cast on the same number of stitches and work the same number of rows that the gauge is in the pattern. You want to do more. So if your pattern says 24 stitches and 30 rows per 4 inches, you need to cast on more than 24 stitches because you want to give yourself more room because the edge stitches are usually a little different. They pull differently and they don't give you an accurate reading. So you just want to kind of have extra stitches on the edges that you know are not going to be accurate so you can get that solid at least 4, probably closer to 6 inches in the middle. And that is why we say we cast on for about 6 to 8 inches. Number 3 is to pay attention to what your swatch is supposed to be, whether it's supposed to be knit flat or in the round, because that will change your gauge. If your pattern is knit in the round, like a top-down seamless sweater, your swatch needs to be knit in the round. If your project is knit flat, then your swatch should be knit flat. Now your pattern should tell you which to do, but if it doesn't, you just refer to what kind of pattern it is. If it's in the round, swatch in the round unless your pattern tells you not to. So an in the round swatch will look something like this with tails along the edge because what you do is instead of purling back, you slide back to the beginning of the round and knit across every row. You will not be purling unless you're following a specific stitch pattern. So you'll have a bunch of floats in the back and you'll cut them and have an edge with fringe on it like this. I'll do an in-depth video on that in the future, but there are some already on YouTube if you just want to look it up. The reason this is so important is because a lot of people purl differently than they knit. So if you're knitting back and forth, then you have one knit row followed by one purl row. But if you were knitting in the round, you would be knitting every round. And so those would be just knit stitches down. And the purling might throw off your gauge. If you purl a lot tighter than you knit, then your gauge is not going to be accurate if you're supposed to be knitting a swatch in the round. Number 4, don't use a garter border. This is one that I only recently learned, but it actually makes a whole lot of sense. So you don't want to do a garter border unless the pattern tells you to. So unless your pattern is worked in garter, don't do a garter border. If it's just worked in stockinette, don't do the garter border because garter has a different row gauge than stockinette will. So if you do a garter border, it will shrink your swatch so it's shorter and not give you an accurate gauge. And that also applies for the beginning and end of the round. What I used to do is just knit a few rows in garter and then knit in stockinette with garter border until the end and then work straight across in garter for a few rows. So it was just kind of all encased in garter, and that can really change your gauge. So to more accurately do it, you want to start just in stockinette if you're working a stockinette swatch, or just start straight in your pattern for whatever it is. So something you could do instead, which I'll link below, Patty Lyons has a great tutorial on this, is doing an edging of a couple of purl stitches and the 2 outer stitches are twisted knit stitches. And that will give you a nice, flat, even bit of stockinette in the middle, and is much more accurate than if you did garter edging. Number 5 is to use a special cast on and don't bind off. So this is another thing I learned from following Patty Lyons. She has a special cast on that kind of creates almost like it has a string going through it. So almost like your stitches are live and on a string. So I'll link that below. It's really great and very helpful. And the reason that you want to do that is because certain cast-ons can make your edging flare or make it too tight, and that can pull your stitches near the cast-on to be a different size than they would be. So this way it just gives it as if they were just staying there live. And the same thing goes for the bind off. You don't want to bind off. Instead, you want to take a long piece of scrap yarn and thread it through all of your live stitches and then tie it so that you have enough room and it's not pulling your stitches. And that way all your stitches are live and they aren't pulled by a bind off. A lot of bind offs, again, do the same thing where they either pull your stitches too tight or too loose, and then that can throw off your accurate reading in the swatch. So you can avoid that by just putting them on a piece of string. Number 6, use the same method of knitting that you will for your final project. So you want to use the same needles, same yarn, and same method. So if you're going to use metal needles for your project, don't swatch with bamboo, because some people can get a slightly different gauge on one material of needle than another. So it's just a safe bet to always swatch with the same exact needles that you'll use. The same thing goes for the yarn. Use the exact same yarn that you will use for your project in your swatch. And finally, use the same method. This also can kind of seem like a no-brainer, but if you're knitting a swatch and you're a continental knitter, you want to knit your swatch that way, the same way that you would your project. So don't for some reason switch over to English for your swatch and then continental knit for your project. Now, one note on that is that let's say you're working a stranded colorwork project and you want to try a different method of holding the yarn in your hand in your swatch. That's great. Go ahead and give it a try in your swatch, but then use that same method when you work your actual project so that the gauge and the tension is all the same. Number 7, swatch at a time that you would normally be knitting. You want to have the same tension that you would be when you're knitting your project. So if you typically knit after work, in bed at night, and you're all relaxed, that is when you should knit your swatch. You shouldn't knit your swatch in a hurry in the morning because you won't be knitting typically like that. And the tension of the yarn and your tension of your gauge can change depending on your surroundings. So if you're in a very calm environment when you knit your sweater, the gauge of that is going to be probably different than the gauge of your swatch if you knit that in a very loud and busy environment, because it can change how you knit. You could be knitting a lot tighter or a lot looser. So if you knit typically at bed at night, you want to knit your swatch there too. If you knit on the subway in the morning, then you should knit your swatch there too. So just try and match them so you knit at the same time. Number 8, you can change your needle size in the middle of a swatch. Totally okay to do that. I didn't really know that until more recently. I used to knit separate swatches, but you can actually just change needles about halfway through your swatch. So you may need to make a slightly longer swatch than normal, but it should all work out. So what you do is you work a good chunk of length with one needle size, switch to another, and what I like to do is put a number of purl bumps that corresponds to the number of my needle size. So if I'm using a US 8 to begin with and I switch to a US 7, then I put 7 purl bumps. So I know that I switched over to a US 7. Just make sure that your swatch is long enough to get a good read on one size and on the other. Number 9 is to block your swatch in the same way that you would block your final project. So if you have a super bulky project like a cardigan or something, and you know that you're not probably going to wash and block your final cardigan, don't wash and block your swatch. Instead, the way that you're going to block that cardigan, let's say, is with a steamer. Then you have to steam your swatch as well so that they're the same methods. So you just want to make sure that they match. If you wet block your sweater, then you're going to want to wet block your swatch so that they end up being the same gauge. Number 10 is to measure your swatch before and after blocking. because you want to know how it's going to change. Because maybe you have a swatch that grows a lot after it's been wet blocked, and the yarn maybe really blooms afterwards, but before is kind of rigid, and it's good to know and keep that in mind when you're knitting your final project. Let's say that project is a sweater, and when you're knitting it, it looks really tiny. But if you know that your swatch grew a lot when you blocked it, then you know your sweater will too. So it's a good thing to keep in mind for that reason. And a lot of times the sweater will say knit to X amount of inches and then, like, let's say separate for the sleeves. Now you want to base that off of your blocked gauge. So you'll count all the rows or whatever and base that off of your blocked gauge. And even if it currently isn't reading the right amount of rows, it should, with blocking, grow, right? If your swatch grew, then your sweater will too. I hope that makes sense. So always go off of the blocked number of rows. So let's say that you need 10 inches and that is 60 rows. And you have knit 60 rows, but you're currently measuring at 9 inches. If you swatched correctly, it should stretch out to 10 because your swatch stretched out. Number 11, you don't have to be aggressive when you block your swatch. I hardly ever pin out and really harshly stretch out my swatch because I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to pull on my swatch a whole lot to get it to work. If it's not working, try changing your needle sizes, and if that doesn't work, you might have to change your yarn. If you're close to matching gauge, you can stretch it out a little bit, but if you're really having to pull on it to match gauge, I would suggest changing needle sizes. One of the reasons I say this is because I have found a lot in the past that a lot of my swatches can be stretched out further than my final project. So if I were to stretch out a swatch a lot, I sometimes can't mimic that with the final project. Because the swatch is so tiny, sometimes it can be very elastic, and oftentimes I didn't find that with the final project. So usually you should just be able to lay it flat and get close to the correct gauge. Again, you can pull it a little bit if you need to just make a few more stitches fit or rows, but you don't want to have to be pulling on it a lot to match gauge. And if you're designing, block it, lay it flat, and just kind of make it look nice so all the stitches are kind of straight in a row, and then measure your gauge after it dries. That way you won't have to do a ton of pulling and stretching and manipulating of your final project. I just lay my swatches flat, and then when I block my finished sweaters, I don't have to tug on them. They're usually just the right size. They don't really stretch out, and I don't have to tug on them. They're just kind of perfectly the right size. That can be a little different with sleeves. I usually have to pull on my sleeves a little bit, but the rest of it works out. Now, this is all true except for probably lace. Lace has a lot of eyelets and yarn overs and things that you want to kind of open it up. So lace, a lot of times you have to pin out and really open it up. But other than that, with most other kinds of fabrics and stitch patterns, you don't really want to tug on it a whole lot. And this also gives you a very good look at what your fabric will look like. So I knew that with this needle size, I tested a couple different needle sizes, but with this one, I really liked the drape that I was getting. It really just laid beautifully after it was washed. And so I knew that this was the fabric I wanted for my final project. And I noticed how it changed because before I washed and blocked it, it was very stiff and rigid, and then I blocked it and now it just has a really, really great drape. And that was also reflected in my final project. My final project before I blocked it, the sweater was pretty stiff and a little structured, a little too structured that is. And then I blocked it and now it has an amazing drape. So it gives you a look at how your fabric will change after you block it. Number 12 is to measure out to a whole number. So when you're measuring your gauge and you're looking for a certain amount of stitches, usually within a 4-inch or 10-centimeter block, you want to measure out to a whole number. That way you can get a more accurate reading. So if you measure out to 4 inches and you're not getting a whole number, maybe you're getting like 14¼ stitches or something, keep measuring out until you can hit an inch number or a centimeter number with a whole number of stitches. So for example, let's say that when you measure out 4 inches, you get close to 12¼ stitches. That's 4 inches. But when you measure out, you can get 18 stitches in 6 inches. So you still need to know how many are in 4 inches. So you take the 18 you got in 6, divide it by 6, and then you'll get 3 stitches per 1 inch. And then you multiply that 3 by 4 inches to get 12 stitches. So you'll know that you get 12 stitches per 4 inches. I hope that makes sense. I'll have it all written down below. But that will give you a more accurate reading because you're measuring over a longer period of time and kind of taking the average of it. And the same thing goes for row gauge. Measure out until you get a whole number. Number 13, don't measure your gauge on a swatch that hasn't dried yet. I cannot stress this enough. If your swatch is still wet, do not measure it. Trust me, I've made this mistake a couple of times and it is so painful because a lot of times your swatch when it's wet will be different than it is when it's dried. I've had things really shrink up after they've dried. When the swatch is wet and soaked, it can really kind of just like flatten out and stretch out, and then when it dries it kind of shrinks back up a little bit. I've made this mistake before where I measured a wet swatch for a sweater, did not remeasure it after it was dried, went ahead and based my math on the wet swatch gauge, made a whole entire sweater, took forever in like light fingering weight yarn, and it was way too small. And then I went back and measured that swatch after it had dried, completely different. And my sweater just didn't fit and I had to scrap the whole idea. So just be patient. I know it can be frustrating to wait, but always plan to give yourself enough time for the swatch to dry. And that leads me into number 14, which is be careful when you use fast drying methods, especially those involving heat. So that would be like using a blow dryer or a heater. And the reason that you want to be careful with this is that sometimes when you apply heat to knitwear, it can shrink more than it would have if it had just dried normally. I made this mistake once on a sweater. I knit a swatch and I put it on like a radiator heater because I was traveling and I really wanted it to dry fast. And then when I measured it, it was one size, and then I made my sweater and it grew to a massive amount because I had based my gauge on the wrong size swatch. Because I had put it on the heater and it had shrunk so much, I thought my gauge was one thing, but it really would have been bigger. So lesson learned there. Be careful with fast drying methods that use heat because it can sometimes shrink your gauge. And then finally, number 15 is just to be careful with superwash yarns. Superwash yarns have a tendency to grow, especially lengthwise after they've been blocked. So I've seen a lot of people that are aware of this and kind of build it into their sweaters. So if they know that their yarn is going to grow, they'll make the sweater a little bit shorter and know that it will grow lengthwise and be the correct length. The same thing happens with sleeves. But you kind of want to play with this and be careful of it when you're swatching. Your swatch should grow in the same way that your sweater should grow, but just be mindful that superwash yarns can grow and expand more than like a natural wool. So those were just a few tips on swatching that I have, but ultimately this is up to you. You don't have to swatch if you don't want to, but then, you know, you're really at a great risk of your project not being the correct size. There is no such thing as meeting gauge every single time without swatching. It won't happen. Maybe you get lucky and you use the same thickness of yarn with the same kind of needles and get gauge. Maybe you get the common like 24 stitches to a 30 stitch fingering weight gauge, which a lot of sweaters are knit at. But then if you were to knit a bulky sweater or something different, you might not match gauge. So you might get lucky a few times, but eventually it's not gonna work out. So I really, really recommend swatching. It's tedious and we all kind of hate it, except for the rare few that enjoy it. But it's so essential if you want your project to fit. And especially with sweaters, because we invest so much time and energy and money into knitting sweaters that you want it to fit. So just take the extra few hours, knit a swatch, wait for it to dry, and then you'll be good to knit your project and you can know for sure that it should fit. So I hope you guys found this video interesting and helpful. I'm gonna try and do more topical videos like this for knitters and designers, so stay tuned for more. Have a great weekend.